10 May 1945, Augsburg. A man named Carl Mertens bent over a school-issue notebook and wrote with a blunt pencil, "We will save ourselves by forgetting in public and remembering in private." He did not show the page to anyone. He knew better. He had learned to speak in layers. One set of words for the Americans, one set for his neighbors, another for himself. The city around him was broken. Brick heaps settled into dust, street grids sketched in piles, a water pump in a crater of shattered pipes. In the weeks after the collapse, women scaled mounds with handcarts and bent backs. Trümmerfrauen in headscarves, forming chains to pass broken brick to hand, stone by stone. Windows were holes. Roofs were gaps lined with tar paper. There were no doors. There were blankets nailed to frames. Occupation began with orders typed in a language many did not read, curfews at 8, weapons surrendered, radios inspected, flags burned. Allied soldiers walked the streets with maps that showed cities intact. The maps were wrong. The ordnance of everyday life became a file card, names filed, dates checked, the arithmetic of survival reduced to each week's ration stamp. An American captain wrote in an occupation report, "Augsburg presents a picture of near-total destruction, particularly its industrial quarters. Population is compliant but fearful, food stocks inadequate." The report was dry. The fear was not. It spread like a fog. Men who had shouted now whispered. Men who had whispered went silent. Carl was 32 years old. He had worked as a clerk in a machine works called Kahn and Son before the factory was bombed flat. He had a wife, Margaret, and a son, Paul, who was 7. His brother had not returned from the east. His father had been buried under their house when the north wall collapsed. He was, as he wrote, home, but not. He could not say aloud that he had been in the party. He had paid dues. He had marched once. He had also sat at his desk and moved invoices from in-tray to out-tray. He understood that both things would be counted now. He did not know the scale. There were missing persons lists pinned to walls in the ruined train station. There were cardboard notices with names in childish script: Anna, Fritz, Irmgard. People scanned them as if by looking they could conjure the missing back into rooms. The Red Cross bulletin boards were dense with hope. Hope was a thin thing. It was rationed like bread. Civilians walked around dead horses and walked past swollen streams of burst sewage. The Allied columns drove slowly through, mud on their tires, engines idling hot. The men in jeeps waved with 2 fingers. They wore clean boots. Many smiled. Others did not. The first days called for prudence. The Trümmerfrauen dug out stairs first. They lifted rubble from steps into buckets and built temporary stairs up the hills of their own destroyed homes. They kept their eyes on their hands. They said stone when asked what they did, and when it was finished another day was done, and they slept on straw and woke to cold. A British intelligence summary from early June wrote, "Civilian morale remains low. Fear of reprisals persists, though organized resistance appears entirely absent. Black market activity increasing. Cigarettes are de facto currency." The summary was a ledger of shortages. It did not include the arithmetic of shame. That was kept off paper. Nighttime was long. The curfew cut the city into islands of whispering. There was still the sound of boots, but they were different boots. Raid sirens were replaced by the hum of mobile generators and the clank of mess kits. Carl walked to the American kitchen and waited in line, hat in hand. He had never begged in his life. He stood under a sign in English and a cartoon of a smiling cook. It felt like the end of something. It also felt like safety. The first winter after surrender was cold. The next winter was worse. It would be named the Hunger Winter, 1946-47. The mathematics of calories became theology. Each week, a card. Ortkart. Fleischkart. Fat was a rumor. There was turnip in everything. Children shivered and grew thin. Women drew lines under their cheekbones like charcoal. Cabbage for breakfast. Cabbage for dinner. Soup that was hot water with the idea of meat dissolved into it. Civilian diaries, later collected in oral histories, were stocked with one word in block letters: hunger. Cigarettes are money now, Carl wrote in the same notebook. Lucky's bought potatoes. Chesterfield's bought boots. A tin of coffee was a treasure, a gift sent in a car paquette from an address in Iowa or New Jersey by someone who did not know his name. The black market was public and shameless. Men with slick hair and quick hands traded in alleys and near train stations. The Allied intelligence colonel wrote, "To be understood, cigarettes function as a stable medium of exchange in lieu of rapidly depreciating Reichsmarks." The economics of defeat did not need subtlety. It passed in hand-to-hand deals, under the eyes of soldiers who preferred order to justice and relief to reform. People went on hamster trips. They pedaled into the countryside with empty panniers and returned with sacks of potatoes. Farmers traded with the city. The pre-war resentments became transactions. One sausage could rent a room. One blanket could buy an afternoon of heat. Old social distinctions were replaced by a new table, calories per favor, the arithmetic of hunger. Liesl Klee, a widow on Maximilian Strate, wrote on the 3rd of December 1946, "I carry bricks in the morning, stand in line in the afternoon, bargain in the evening. I used to play piano. I still have my hands." The sentence was printed later in a local Heimatbuch compiled in the 1950s without the last clause. Some truths were too exact for new times. By 1946, denazification was a program with forms and hearing rooms. The law for the liberation from National Socialism and militarism came on 5 March 1946. The forms were dense. The Fragebogen had 131 questions. There was no room for poetry. There was every space for perfect recall. The categories were numbered, as if the soul could be sorted like inventory. Hauptschuldig, major offenders. Belastet offenders. Minder belastet, lesser offenders. Mitläufer followers. Entlistiter, exonerated. Each came with a prescribed fate. Each had a formula. Carl sat at a table and filled in his questionnaire with a borrowed fountain pen. He wrote, Mitgliedszeit 1937, and then crossed out the year and wrote 1938. He wrote Sachbearbeiter, which meant clerk. He wrote no participation in any political crimes. He listed his attendance at one rally as compelled by supervisor. He was careful. He reached for adjectives that hinted at reluctance. He practiced the language of minimal responsibility, the rhetoric of habit. The mathematics of guilt demanded subtraction. Spushkammer hearings convened in school auditoriums and city halls with broken windows covered in plywood. Panels of Germans sat in judgment under Allied oversight. Witnesses testified in fingers pointed and palms held open. The word Mitläufer expanded until it was a room that could hold a nation. The impersonal atmosphere existed not because no one felt anything, but because feeling had to be siphoned off from process. The files reflected. In the denazification file for Carl M., Augsburg City Archive, a clerk noted, shows attitude of compliance with new order. No evidence of active opposition to Nazism found. Category, IV, Mitläufer. Outcome, fine, employment permitted. The category was generous. It was needed. Allied occupation officers wanted stability. They wanted trains to run and sewage to flow. They wanted communists watched and rail lines rebuilt. Ideal justice would have meant empty offices and silent factories. Practical justice meant that men with the right ledgers returned to familiar desks. "We need administrators more than penitents," a US officer typed in a personal letter, later excerpted in a Bundesarchiv finding aid. The letter was not policy, but it captured the arithmetic of restoration. There were too many guilty acts and not enough jails. There were too many quiet arrangements. The mathematics of guilt bent toward continuity. The police changed uniforms, but often kept their faces. The new mayor, Dr. Vogel, had what the Americans called clean hands, and yet the man he appointed as housing director had signed a declaration in 1933 that looked bad in 1933, that looked bad in 1946. He said then, as he said now, "I am a practical man. I put people in rooms." He did. He put refugees from the East into the bedrooms of Augsburg couples. He did the work that made strangers neighbors, and enemies neighbors, and neighbors adversaries. His office received bribes of eggs and butter and envelopes of cigarettes. He called it grease. The files call it gifts. The mathematics of rooms could be shifted by an extra 100 grams of butter. Expellees arrived on trains and on foot. Germans pushed out of Silesia, from Königsberg, from the Sudetenland, from the Vistula. They carried heavy bundles wrapped in blankets. They wore coats that were not warm enough. They had papers stamped in Russian and Polish and Czech. They had children, and the children had coughs. They brought into West German towns a new wave of suffering that was both their own and an accusation. In a town already full, the arithmetic of space turned into an argument that lasted years. A Bavarian municipal report dated 17 February 1947 reads, 3,812 refugees arrived in the last quarter, total, now 18,450. Available dwellings, 12,000 Trund. Of these, 4,300 damaged. Average occupancy increased to 2.9 persons per room. Numbers turned people into figures. The numbers multiplied resentments. Locals said, "We have lost enough already." Newcomers said, "We have only what we can hold." The police recorded fights. The new Germany was glazed with a thin layer of law spread over a deep bed of scarcity. Among the expellees was a young woman named Anna Karasek from the Sudetenland. She wrote on 24 August 1946, "They say, go back. I have nowhere to go back to. They say you are not one of us. I have no other us." She found a bed in the corner of a room where the local family hung their winter clothes. The coat smell was strong. She worked as a laundress. She sent money to a cousin in Lübeck she had never met. She wrote lists of small savings. The arithmetic of belonging was not precise. It changed with each meal shared or refused. Displaced persons' camps went up on the outskirts of towns and in the husks of old barracks. Feldafing, Landsberg, Ferrenwald. British reports called them DP camps, and the name did not say who was inside. They were survivors. Jews who had been in camps, forced laborers from Poland and Ukraine, Yugoslavs, Italians, Dutchmen, Soviets, stateless people. Some refused to go home, others could not. The camps were close enough to see, but far enough for Germans to pretend not to. The moral geometry of their placement was not accidental. It was the line between proximity and denial. At the edge of Augsburg, in a former Wehrmacht facility, Italians and Poles lived in long rooms heated by iron stoves. The Americans brought medical officers, rabbis, chaplains. They encouraged self-government in blocks. Relief organizations distributed clothing. The world replenished those it could. German civilians walked past the fence and looked in. Some did not. The camps were reminders that suffering continued beyond their streets. The arithmetic of misery did not allow for exclusive claims. One afternoon in October 1945, a unit of the U.S. Army brought a group of German civilians to Dachau for a mandatory tour. The order came with the tone of law, to be confronted with what took place also in their names. The group included Karl. He wrote later in his notebook, "I saw rooms where people died. I smelled it." The man said, "This is what you supported." I said nothing. There was only the sound of shoes on concrete. Many who went returned to kitchens where they could not find words. Many who did not go found new words for not going. I did not know. I could not know. It had the same rhythm in every town. Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau. These names were printed in newspapers, spoken in newsreels in movie houses where audiences sat still and let the sound wash over them. The newsreels called them concentration camps. The word was an ocean. The people in the seats shared armrests and an awkward silence. They had their own dead. They clung to the story that their dead was sufficient to explain their despair. The contact with victims was an international history presented in local rooms. The arithmetic of guilt met the arithmetic of bombings. They did not balance. There were also meetings that were smaller. A Jewish man named Herschel Rosen, living in Feldafing, came into town to trade for eggs. He met a woman on the tram who looked at his arm and then at his face and said, "I am sorry." He nodded. He did not say what he was sorry for. He did not say what he was sorry for. He wrote in a letter preserved in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, "What can they say? What can I hear?" In the New Germany, words were tokens, and their value fluctuated with the exchange rate of memory. By 1947, the denazification lists were long, and the categories were applied by men who began to tire. A US intelligence report observed, "Denazification is inducing administrative paralysis." Files sat in piles on desks. People waited. Business called. Church bells rang. Weddings were held in half-standing churches, with wood scaffolds bent like rib cages. Babies were born. They were thin, but they cried. The occupation authorities printed posters that read, "Demokratie." They taught classes on local self-government. Town halls offered courses on citizenship, on the new constitution in draft. Germans sat on hard seats and nodded. In interviews conducted decades later, many of those Germans said they thought, then, that democracy was what had happened without them. They were being asked to make room for it in their rooms. The arithmetic of politics was not separate from the arithmetic of space. There were not enough chairs. Food shipments began to arrive in larger quantities. The Marshall Plan became more than speeches. European Recovery Program crates were stenciled with stars, flour, milk powder, coal. The trucks went from depots to bakeries to factories that were down to their foundations and rising again. The presence of American support was not only a matter of goods, it was a statement of an alignment. The Cold War began to set in like a weather pattern, and the new climate changed priorities. Adenauer said, "Keine Experimente." No experiments, stability. That meant a recalibration of denazification. It meant allowing the machine to run. It meant, as Article 31 of the new Basic Law would later formalize, that former civil servants dismissed during the purge could be re-employed. There was an amnesty in 1949 and further measures in 1951 and 1954. Files were closed, stamps were applied. State prosecutors looked elsewhere. The mathematics of guilt found a political limit. The arithmetic of the Cold War overruled the algebra of the past. Karl found work in a factory that rebuilt machines that could be sold abroad. It was 1948. The currency changed on 20 June. The day after the Währungsreform, store windows in Augsburg filled with goods. The black market slowed, then thinned, then ran underground. Karl carried new Deutsche Marks in his pocket and felt, for the first time since 1945, that money could plan. He bought Margaret a dress from a rack, not from a suitcase at a back door. He smoked a cigarette because he wanted to smoke, not because he needed to buy bread. He recorded, The feeling is like taking a breath after holding it for 3 years. He also wrote, "There are men in the office who wore pins, I recognize. We do not speak of pins." The Wirtschaftswunder was not a miracle. It was coal burned steadily. It was machines well oiled. It was the reconstruction of old capacities with new capital. It was the replacement of bombed bridges with concrete spans. It was the training of a generation of technicians who did not remember the early Hitler years as anything but childhood. It was, too, the making of a public story. In that story, the bombings were emphasized, the expulsions mourned, the losses counted. The other story, the one that led to the camps and to fields thick with the dead, was kept at the edges. It was not absent. It was quiet. The mathematics of memory could be balanced many ways. Schoolbooks in the early 1950s softened the narrative. They spoke of hard years and national misdirection. They emphasized the Hitler regime as a time of error that had closed in on a fundamentally decent people. They did not dwell on the mechanics of complicity. They did not teach how to fill a form and stay human. In public commemorations, plaques went up for the dead of the air raids. Lists of expellees were read in church halls. Photographs of burned neighborhoods were displayed. "This happened," Germans said, "to us." The phrase "in our name" was rarely said. In 1952, the Lastenausgleichsgesetz created a system of payments to those who had lost property in the East. It was a recognition of displacement. It was money to buy first furnishings and first machines. It was also an administrative structure that required certification. Karl's desk at the city office received applications. He reviewed claims. He assigned values to wardrobes and missing plows. He wrote numbers on lines that defined grief as property loss and trauma as an actuarial table. He wrote with a ruler to keep the lines straight. He had learned to do this work under other regimes. He did it well now. The file entries were precise. The people who came through his office were not. They were full of stories. He noted often, applicant becomes emotional. He kept a handkerchief in his drawer. The Cold War made lines that were not ruins. The inner German border hardened. Augsburg received relatives from the East now as visitors, not as potential residents. They came with the smell of other coal on their coats. They told stories of expropriations under a different vocabulary. They criticized the West's glitz. They carried baskets of smoked meats. They brought back margarine cakes from Western bakeries wrapped in cellophane. Family dinners were small conferences. The arithmetic of dinner seating mirrored the arithmetic of alliances. The table could be set many ways. Karl's son Paul grew tall. He wore hair slicked back with pomade. He listened to American music on the radio and to his father's silence at meals. In civics class, the teacher spoke of the basic law and of rights. He did not mention what it meant to make a list of Jews in a building and send it up the chain. He did not explain that a country could build a legal framework and then use its accounting to manage the unthinkable. There were limits to what a classroom could bear. The documents remained in archives. They collected dust that was not symbolic but still felt like it. A Bundesarchiv file compiled in 1956, Lageberichte zur politischen Stimmung, noted, "Generational shift evident. Youth embrace Western cultural forms." Older generation remains privately conservative, publicly compliant. The note could have been written about any country. In West Germany, it marked a deeper disjunction. The public story was polished. The private inventory was incomplete. Karl sent money to his brother's widow when the letter came from Thuringia announcing Georg had died in 1944 near Vitebsk. The letter was late and full of euphemism. "Fallen for the fatherland," it said. There was no grave. There was no body to plant flowers near. The city placed a plaque in a church to our fallen. The names were many. The ceremony was solemn. The photographs taken after the event show men in suits and women in hats looking tired in the bright sun. The photographer captured Karl in the second row. He is clapping. His face is expressionless. The caption reads, "Augsburg remembers." The DP camps shrank. Some Jews emigrated to Palestine and later Israel. Others went to America. Some stayed in Munich or Frankfurt. The forced laborers returned, or were repatriated, or simply vanished into new identities. The moral shock of their presence faded in the town's daily fodder. The grocery lines got shorter. The tram schedule stabilized. The newspapers turned to headlines about the Bundestag, about NATO, about football matches. The layer of ordinary life thickened until it covered what lay beneath like snow. Not all the past stayed quiet. In 1958, Frankfurt prosecutors opened investigations that would lead, years later, to the Auschwitz trials. Newspapers ran stories about guards and doctors and clerks. Names that had been spoken in whispers returned in legal pleadings. Men who had been followers were asked to testify. Karl read the articles and went to work. His own name was not in the paper. He had the luxury to sigh. He also had the knowledge that his ease was part of a system's design. The United States needed his city solvent. The government needed his quiet. He needed his job and his own peace. There were bargains everywhere. There were also small acts of repair. In 1954, Anna married, moved to a village near Augsburg, and had 2 children. She planted a lilac bush by the entrance of her new apartment. She wrote, "The smell of lilac is the smell of a room that is mine." Liesel joined a church choir. She wrote, "I sing to remember that my breath belongs to me." Herschel sent a photo of his infant son from Tel Aviv. The picture made it across a sea and a new language to a bakery somewhere in Augsburg where someone who had once looked at the tattoo on his arm hung the image on a nail next to a calendar. The photograph stayed there longer than the calendar. The Bundesarchiv holds occupation reports about Augsburg that mention no individual and contain the word satisfactory many times. The words grief, shame, guilt appear rarely. They were left to private pages. Karl's notebook thickened with entries that differed in tone as the years passed. The early pages were short and hard. The later ones were longer and softer. In a 1950 entry, he wrote, "We have new cups without cracks." In 1952, Paul wants a bicycle. I say yes. In 1955, I dream of brick dust. Denazification had been a process and a pretext. It had separated the worst from the many. It had also become a filter that sifted a planet of grey into manageable categories. Allied intentions were not uniform. British and American approaches diverged. French leniency influenced local outcomes. The Soviet zone pursued its own reckoning. The mathematics of justice depended on a post office's address. The tables in the Ministry of the Interior at the state level displayed numbers about categories and outcomes. Percentages of exonerated rose over time. Society shifted toward closure. The law moved the line of who could hold office. Men who had been removed returned to desks. The knowledge sat in rooms like an uninvited guest. In the 1960s, the next generation began to ask questions that could not be managed with the old words. Students took to the streets in Frankfurt and Berlin. They asked their professors what their fathers had done. They asked the state why it had reintegrated so many. They asked why the story they had been taught in school did not include the names of the local who had written the lists. In Augsburg, these questions arrived like mail. They were read at tables where older men cleared their throats. Karl wrote in 1968, "Paul asks me, 'What did you do?' I say, 'I filled forms.' He says, 'For whom?' I say, 'For the city.' He did not write the conversation verbatim. He wrote only the skeleton of it, the bones he could see. He did not write his son's face. He knew that his set of truths was becoming, in the new Germany, insufficient. He also understood that his life had been possible because of what was unsaid. But the 1940s still framed the ceiling of his days. The hunger winter marked his sense of cold. The Marshall Plan set his measure of aid. The question of guilt defined the border of his own conscience. The black market taught him the price of things. The care packages made foreign words feel like kindness. The DP camp at the city limits was a map card he could not set aside. He walked past the fence. He remembered the face of a man who looked at his arm and then at his face. He did not know what to call that moment. He knew only that it counted. The arithmetic of rooms remained a problem he balanced in his sleep. He dreamt of the ledger in 1952, where he had to take space from one person and give it to another. He woke with words in mind. We will save ourselves by forgetting in public and remembering in private. He had written that in 1945. He reread it often with a mix of relief and regret. It had been true then. It had been useful. It had not been a solution. In the city archive in Augsburg, there is a file from 1949 with a small slip of paper signed Mertens. It authorizes a compensation payment to a widow of a man who died in an air raid in 1944. There is another file with his initials on a housing allocation for a family of 4 from East Prussia. There is a third with his name typed under a list of names of men who were suitable for reappointment to municipal posts. The names include 2 who were party members in 1933. The memo is stamped approved. These are small marks, facts on paper that are a life's outline. The front line of Karl's war after the war ran through them. The documentary story of lives like his is made up of dossiers and absence. The Allied intelligence summaries flatten out the spikes of human noise. The denazification files harden into categories, a bureaucracy's frozen empathy. The Bundesarchiv records are tidy in order, untidy in meaning. The oral histories fill in gaps with feelings that do not map onto action neatly. There is a moral geometry that viewers want, good people and bad people and a line between. The post-war years in Germany do not offer that. They offer a web built by necessity and silence. The expellees slowly became locals. They married into the town. Their children shared dialects. The arithmetic of us adjusted. The DP camps emptied. The fences came down. The city put a factory there. Workers park their bicycles by the fence posts that once held barbed wire. No plaque explains the ground. Or, later, a plaque is placed and few read it. Or, later still, a school class visits, and their teacher speaks on a windy day into a sound that does not carry to the back row. The mathematics of remembrance has variables, date, weather, the teacher's patience, the attention span of teenagers. It produces sometimes nothing. It produces sometimes a student who goes home and asks a question that makes an old man inhale and be 15 again. Karl ages. He retires in 1974 from the city office with a small gift, a certificate framed, a fountain pen engraved with his name. He holds the pen and thinks of the first form he filled for the New Times, when he crossed out 1937 and wrote 1938. He remembers the feel of the borrowed pen, heavy and unaccustomed, in a room that smelled of smoke and wet wool. He remembers the hearing where a chairman asked him if he had ever been more than a follower, and he said no. And the relief of the word Mitläufer as a blanket. He has grandchildren. He tells them stories about the hunger and the black market, and about hiding from the pastor as a boy when he had broken a window. He does not talk about Dachau. He does not talk about the eyes of the men at the DP camp. He does not talk about the way he learned to fill forms in a particular language and how that language survived the regime that taught it to him. He knows how to put commas in the right place. He has always known this. It is not enough to define him. It is enough to describe him. He listens to the radio. He reads the newspaper. He hears trials being conducted. He sees on television the wall in Berlin, then its open breach. He thinks, when crowds cheer at the wall, that this is the first public joy in the country that is not stolen from anyone. The cheering feels clean. He knows that the human condition is not algebra. He knows that we still try to make it into an equation. On 10 May 1985, 40 years to the day after his entry, Karl wrote again in a new notebook. The paper was smoother. The pen slipped easily. He wrote in a hand that was smaller but steady. We saved ourselves by forgetting in public and remembering in private. It saved us from chaos. It did not save us from ourselves. He paused. He closed the book. He went to the window and looked at the street. The asphalt was smooth. The trees were tall. Children biked along the curb without hands on the handlebars, their arms out fearless. He knew, as he had known when he first wrote the line, that his country rested on arrangements. The arrangements had included what could not be said in 1945 and what was not said in 1950 and what would not be glossed over by 1968. He did not think that this made him a monster. He did not think that this made him innocent. He thought this made him a man who had lived through a time that pushed every choice through a narrow gate. He had squeezed through, not without loss. He had kept his family fed. He had placed strangers in rooms. He had returned men to desks. He had shared bread with those who had nothing, and he had been silent when it would have cost him everything to speak. He understood the price of bread and the weight of silence. The city archive, the occupation reports, the denazification files, the Allied intelligence summaries, the Bundesarchiv, the oral histories, all these layers would be used by someone later to tell a story. He wondered if that story would speak in the tone the times had required. He wondered if it would assign him a category. He smiled at the thought that every category becomes a refuge eventually. At the end of a life lived between lines on paper and lines on streets, Karl wrote one last note on the back page of his first notebook, now brittle at the corners. The line we could not say aloud. I wrote here because I did not want it to be forgotten. I do not know if it forgives. I know only that it is true for me. He signed his initials. He put the notebook back on the shelf behind a book of municipal budget regulations. He returned to the table, where the afternoon light was thin, and filled in a form for the tax office so his pension would be adjusted correctly. He put the commas in the right place. He dated the form. He folded it precisely. He placed it in an envelope. He licked the stamp and affixed it. He stood and pulled on his coat. He walked out to the mailbox at the corner. He dropped the envelope in. The sound it made, paper hitting metal, was light. That sound was his last small service, and like so many before it, it marked that the front line after 1945 had run not across a battlefield, but through his memory and his paperwork.